Alright, so now that we've gone over the three variables to getting your exposure right in your camera, let's talk about how they work together. First, we talked about the aperture. The aperture is the actual opening in your lens, and when you control it, you control how wide or small that opening is, letting in more or less light. And then we talked about shutter speed. Shutter speed is simply the length of time that your shutter is open, letting in more or less light. And lastly, we talked about your ISO. Your ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. So when you make it more sensitive, you let in more light. And when you make it less sensitive, you let in less light. When you take a photo and you're using your camera in manual mode, you'll consider each of these things individually. How open is my aperture? How fast is my shutter speed? And what's my ISO? How sensitive is it to light? Together, these things are called the exposure triangle because each part pulls your photo in one direction or another, sort of like the volume sliders on a mixer board. If you turn the volume up with just one slider, it gets a little bit louder. Two sliders and it gets even louder, and all three and it gets very loud, which is really similar to how this works with light. If you open your aperture, you get a little more light. If you lengthen your shutter speed, you get even more light. And if your ISO is more sensitive, you get even more light. So you can shift these up and down individually, little by little, to figure out exactly the formula you want for the right amount of light. The other thing to consider is that each of these variables has something else that it does. When your aperture is more open, you're going to have a more shallow depth of field, meaning that fewer things in your photo are going to be in focus. Sometimes you want that sort of effect. Say you want to have the focus on someone's eyes and the rest of the background is all a wash of color and blur. Well, if your aperture is more open, you're letting in more light, so you might have to use your ISO or your shutter speed to cut down on some of the light. Same with shutter speed. Think about it. If you want a long, open shutter speed because you want to catch more blur in your photo, you're going to have to maybe close down on your aperture or maybe lower your ISO sensitivity. Same with the other way. If you want a really fast shutter speed because you want to capture the action and you want to freeze it, you might have to open up your aperture a little bit or bump up the sensitivity of your ISO. And finally, with ISO, the other thing that ISO does is sometimes it makes your photos noisy. So if you have a really high ISO, it's going to be more sensitive to light, but you'll probably have more noise in your photo. If you want less noise in your photo, you'll lower your ISO, so it'll be less sensitive to light. But that means that the photo will be darker, so you might need to open up your aperture or have a longer shutter speed. Just remember that all of these things work together, like sliders on a mixer board. One goes up, one goes down. It's all in how you want the photo to come out in the end. And the best way to figure it out is just to go out and experiment and play.